Friends, the last time we were sitting around the workbench was when I built this Lend-Lease Valentine Mark 9 from two kits, Tamiya and Bronco. On top of that, I spiced the model up with photo etch from Voyager, added a generous amount of battle damage according to a historical photograph, and loaded it up with some stowage and 3 figures, setting it up for a diorama. But before we even start thinking about creating some exciting landscapes, another fun time awaits us. Full painting and weathering. So grab some popcorn and let's jump right into it. One of my least favorite steps is right at the beginning. Tearing the model down into sub-assemblies. Sometimes the teardown is quite literal, as was the case with this tanker sitting on a blanket. How much you want to break your model down is completely individual, and it greatly depends on the subject as well. For this model, I glued the rolled wheels and suspension bogies in place, and only the tracks and drive sprockets are removable. Again, it's up to you and how you feel comfortable painting your model. This breakdown allowed me to fix the hull to my Octopus M2M painting stand, which will allow me to reach the model from all angles without touching it, and the turret will be sitting atop this small jig that also came with the stand. And the figures? They're traditionally pinned using 1mm wires to cork stoppers. Now, this model contains a lot of metal. Roughly 1/3 of it is made from brass, and that calls for some metal primer. It comes in very handy because, if I say it as simply as possible, it makes metal behave more like plastic when it comes to paint adhesion. Even a high-quality general-purpose primer can peel off these surfaces, but the metal primer makes them more sticky, so to say. It's become my tradition to prime models completely with a black primer, although there are exceptions where I use dark brown. But the traditional light gray primer, I have a bottle of it, but I haven't even touched it. Brown is excellent when I want to do some hairspray chipping, as it works as a nice base for rust zones. And black is amazing for my favorite post-shading approach. You often have different tools that all work amazingly, but they really shine in specific situations. Case in point, I quickly primed the figures as well, although this video won't be about them, and once they were completely black, I gave them light pre-shade from above using Deck Tan from Tamiya. That's essentially what I try to emulate when I'm painting armor models, but of course it works more efficiently and feels more natural on figures. Anyway, back to the model. It's all nice and black and smooth, an excellent base for painting, and I always take a moment to appreciate all the steel textures that I created because this is when they begin to stand out. As for the base color, Valentines were painted in British SCC2 brown, and the Soviets rarely repainted their Lend-Lease vehicles. I've heard that this is one of the ugliest paints to work with, but that only made me more intrigued. As I was building the model, it was brought up by one of my Patreon members, Shermanator, that the new Tamiya XF90 Red Brown 2, which is the updated, so to say, German Red Brown, is actually a perfect match for SCC2, even when you compare it to Mike Starmer's research on this color. That was excellent news for me because I bought this paint for my Tiger F13, but never used it. It's just a very ugly color, but yeah, I have to admit, although I'm not an expert on British armor, in fact I'm quite the opposite of that, but this really looks like the actual color sample of the real thing, and it fits the definition of one of the ugliest colors ever. However, I'm all about that post shading, and for this session I chose buff from Tamiya as the highlighting tone, mixing it directly in the airbrush. I knew that the brown tank will pose some challenges once I start applying earth effects because these are very similar to the base coat, so I had two options. Shift the base color to a less saturated tone and use rich, vivid earth tones, or make the base coat saturated and use subdued, grayish earth tones. The latter option seemed more appealing and effective to me, and I'd like to mention that with post shading, in many cases, any color accuracy goes right out of the window because you're heavily altering it in one direction or the other. However, having an accurate starting point is always pretty nice. Check out how the color changed from almost black to something where we can start to appreciate all the surface details. Moving on, I like to push the colors as far as I can, even if the sacrifice is losing sight of how the actual paint should look like. Each model is like a playground for me, and I love having a good time with it, even during these initial airbrushing stages. The nice thing about this approach is that you can decide when you push the color just enough, and if you went too far, you can actually always go back with some darker, highly diluted paint. I'd rather sacrifice some of that accuracy for a more contrasting model that's easier to observe, even if the light conditions aren't perfect, like in my studio for example. Also, note that the paint is shiny. That's because I added a good amount of gloss varnish into the mixture. It's not about the shiny part, but more about paint saturation. If I sprayed the model with flat paint, it would turn much darker once I sealed the finished paint job with a coat of varnish. This is where I reached my limit, and the model looks more khaki than ugly green-brown, but again, I'm okay with that sacrifice. Before I could bring out the paintbrushes though, I had some extra work to do. I decided to base coat some of the hard stowage just to make my life easier later. I rarely use masks nowadays because I never really enjoyed the process, and if there's some faint overspray, it's usually easy to tone it down with the upcoming steps. Also, another benefit of having a glossy base coat, it's easier to work with decals. I chose this simple marking just to make it easier to understand that it's a vehicle in Soviet use. The decals from Bronco are really thick and stiff, and even an aggressive softener like the one from VMS had a hard time dealing with them. Once that was all taken care of, I coated the entire model with a generous, wet coat of VMS flat varnish. Nowadays I prefer to have my models matte because they won't cast any crazy reflections once they're placed in the diorama under a very specific angle, which is quite often. And even now the surface is easier to observe and you can better soak in the subtle contrast in the base coat. Okay, it's time to have fun with pin washes, and for this model I chose a track wash. I guess it wasn't originally designed for tanks themselves, like their actual paint job. Instead, their tracks seem to be the main target of this wash. However, I find its grayish-brown shade perfect for many types of surfaces, and here it just works so well with the brown camouflage. I have to say though, the flat surface gave me a bit of trouble at first, as the enamel paint would quickly bite into the flat texture, becoming difficult to blend properly. But it was just about changing my workflow though. I focused on smaller areas at a time, and suddenly it was a really pleasant experience. I always enjoy watching how the pin wash works in tandem with the post-shaded surface, enhancing its contrast. Also, once you get comfortable with blending washes over a flat surface, your reward will be this subtle initial pre-weathering of sorts, as the wash creates these faint dirt passes around details. It can often visually darken the model, and that's one of the reasons I like to work with very pale base coats. I tried to do some additional post-shading in my last diorama when I was weathering the Melusine armored suit, and I said that this kind of deal probably won't work on tanks. Well, guess what? It does. And it's a lot of fun. Basically, it's the same thing as painting fake shadows with oil paints, but the workflow is much faster. I'm not sure how many of us realize this, it definitely took me a long time, but it's crazy how much time you can save when you don't have to swap between different paints, palettes and brushes all the time. I already had this paint in my metal palette, and I had the job done in less than 10 minutes. If I had to squeeze out oil paints on a piece of cardboard and use those, I'd be waiting at least half an hour for them to drain. It's just convenient when you can streamline your workflow. Okay, so now we have our detailed model outlined and there are already some hints of weathering and forced contrast. I always love looking at models after this stage because they look so clean yet sort of finished at the same time. And while I'm at it, I'd like to mention this interesting product called Brush Conditioner from Modeler's World. It actually cleans them better than thinner or water, depending on the paint, and I never thought I'd enjoy an unusual product like this. It says it cleans acrylics and oils, but it cleaned the enamel wash without any issues. Next up, some bright earthy acrylics. This step is definitely optional and even more controversial, but I love doing it. The pin wash will often seep into small details and make them much darker than the rest of the surface. Which is fine, of course, but I like them to be more visible, especially if I added so many of these bolts myself. The effect gets toned down later down the road, but it's good to keep it rather subtle. I definitely got carried away this time, and some of these are painfully unnatural, but you'll notice that I made sure to tone them down with effects such as chipping and rust. Yup, looks awful, but bear with me for a while, and by a while I mean the rest of the video. Moving on, it's chipping time. I mixed AK's red brown and German grey for a nice faded steel tone. I varied this mixture, and in some cases I used pure red brown because I really like its rusty color. Paint drying retarder is very important, and I recently started loving this long bristled Marta Kolinsky paintbrush for the job. Chipping is always gonna be a slow process, and if you don't believe me, I once spent 70 hours chipping a tiger. A lot has changed since then, and I was feeling conflicted. On one hand, I like my models when they're heavily chipped, but on the other, I don't want to spend dozens of hours on each model, dancing across the surface with a tiny paintbrush and straining my eyes. So I had to slowly adjust my approach and find a compromise that actually works. I tried using a sponge for a while, refining the random chips with a paintbrush, but I didn't really enjoy that workflow. Then I completely dropped a good half of the job by skipping the first layer of light superficial chips. These give the chipping a three-dimensional look and make it stand out nicely, but I found that with these pale post-shaded base coats, the chipping always stands out pretty nicely on its own. And then it was about the paintbrush. A small 000 brush gives you excellent control and pinpoint accuracy, but doesn't hold a lot of paint, and you spend quite a lot of time bouncing between the model, the palette, and a napkin where you unload the excess paint. A longer brush holds more paint, so you spend more time on the model, and actually, the bending bristles help you with those random, irregular shapes. It's a really nice change, and what used to take me at least 40 hours on a 1/35 scale model can be now done in one prolonged session at the workbench, let's say 8 to 10 hours, or in 2 sessions if my back hurts too much. While I was chipping away, I wanted to treat the busted headlight because it also required some chipping. I always painted these details with some generic silver color, but for the first time, I tried a proper chrome paint from AK. This one seems to be lacquer based and thus very durable, and I'm head over heels for this result. With some subtle chipping, it's one of the best details on this model. Alright, now we have the acrylic work out of the way, and that's another milestone in this paint job. Now I was ready to switch to enamels, or so I thought. You see, enamel rust washes were my preferred option for the longest time. They are reliable and easy to use, but not on this model. Maybe it was the flat base coat, although I have been using it for a while, or the light khaki brown color, but I was struggling to keep them controlled. Most of the time they just spilled into the surface as I was blending them, and there wasn't even a hint of that nice, controlled, focused rust that enhances the chipping effects. Kinda discouraged, I sucked it up and at least finished the mudguards, thinking that these are made from sheet metal and they would rust more than the hardened armor plates. My second option was using oil paints, even though I didn't have good experiences with them in the past. I tried painting rust with these oils on my Syrian T55, but quickly switched to enamels because they were leaving visible tide marks on the flat surface. However, here, they blended like a dream. Subtle and easy to blend, and what's more, I could layer them on top of each other because they were drying pretty fast, but not fast enough to make things more complicated. Even the bright orange color, oxide patina, was working perfectly, and I could add multiple rust zones in a very controlled manner. I'm kinda starting to think that the next model could be treated completely with oil paints. What do you think? Oh, and one of the most dreadful scenarios is when your rust doesn't dry to a flat finish, and then you have to spray those areas with a flat varnish. And to be fair, the oils left a satin residue in some places, but all of that disappeared overnight. The next day I was looking at a rusty, worn down tank with beautiful, gritty textures. Note how the rust tones suddenly changed the overall tone of the model as well, knocking some of that light khaki brown down a notch, and bringing it maybe 5% closer to how it actually should look like. And with this process behind us, it's time to paint the small details, but more importantly, the nice pile of stowage in the back. Most of the details can be actually painted with various shades of grey, such as these electric cables or the rubber antenna base. The wheels have their rims completely worn down and polished by the tracks, and I used natural steel for this. I enhanced this effect by adding some rusty chipping around the edges, but most of this will be invisible on the finished model. And the padding was painted with rubber black. Having those wheels glued to the model actually made the process faster. And now for the stowage. I decided to start with the captured fuel drum because I wanted to employ the sponge method, and that's always a bit messy. I've read somewhere that most German drums were left unpainted in their galvanized steel finish. I don't know how true is that statement, but it was an opportunity to make an exciting texture. I found plenty of color images online and picked those that I liked the most as references. The sponge on its own would only get me so far, and I quickly switched to wet blending using the same 3 grey acrylic paints. I kept it rather messy, and once they dried, the result was very authentic. Then I could paint the rusty rings and other small details, and one thing I noticed in references was that the embossed letters and numbers, those actually have a dark rusty finish on top of them, and the light galvanized finish around them acts as a pin wash. That's a pretty cool detail. The rest of the finish was created with enamels and oil paints. I used the same wash as on the tank to outline the details and add generous dirt stains. I even painted a fake shadow on the underside of the barrel. This was part of the model where I truly appreciated the awesome properties of those rusty oil paints, but it's very important to check references here. Galvanized steel doesn't rust too much, and most of it comes from those rings holding the drum together. Again, they left a bit of a shiny finish once I was done, but when I woke up the next morning, the entire part was completely flat. Now I could paint the rest of the stowage, completely with acrylics. I started by painting everything with a dark brown color. It's a mixture of red brown and pure black. This can take a lot of time, especially when we're trying to outline stowage that's hard to reach, but it plays a vital role in the painting process. Even with something as simple as natural wood on these crates, the black-brown undercoat helps us achieve more depth and contrast, enhancing the wood grain texture. The first layer was painted with British khaki, while the second, lighter and more greyish tone, was done with light earth. The dark base makes them look less saturated, and the result looks very authentic, although a bit stylistic. Stains of dirt or some random discoloration on individual planks can be quickly added with different glazes, although here I used the same black-brown color, just heavily watered down. I actually used the same paints to paint the ropes. I twisted these from 0.2mm copper wires because every string I tried was always too fuzzy. It's more tedious to make them from wires, but the result is smooth and quite durable. Finally, I could treat the tarps, and I painted them in a way that would provide as much contrast with the tank's brown finish as possible. Note how I paint them as separate layers, and this way it's easier to paint each tarp without accidentally brushing unwanted paint onto the other. But how does that technique actually work? Well, it's actually not very hard, thanks to the dark base coat. I start with the basic color, in this case some military olive green. The point is to start with the color as it comes out of the bottle, so pretty dark. Then I just keep adding small amounts of light earth into the green paint, making it lighter with each layer. I kept the black-brown undercoat visible around the deepest folds and where the tarp overlaps itself, as this acts as a subtle shadow and outline. Each light layer should cover smaller and smaller areas, because this way you'll achieve rather smooth color transitions even without blending. I wasn't too worried about the lower part where the tanker will sit, of course. And if by any chance the transitions seem a bit harsh, a gentle glaze with the base color will nicely tie them together. It's a rather straightforward process once you get used to it, and most of the time I'm worried about choosing the best color that will contrast nicely with the tank and the rest of the stowage. Now, of course, my painting style is heavily stylistic and focuses on heavy contrasts, but that's because A, I have fun doing it that way, and B, earth effects will tone it down. If the contrast was subtle to begin with, it would become invisible on the weathered model. It's about the overall big picture, you know. I was in a strong acrylic painting mood after this stage, so I quickly painted the tanker sitting in the turret. However, I'll show you the process in more detail in the next video, where I'll build the diorama and paint the remaining 2 soldiers. Right now I want to focus on heavy mud tones, and what a great start it is when you grab some kind of acrylic texture paste. The last time I made a model covered in heavy mud was the AMX 50B from Resin Scales, and before I even started building this model, I knew it would be situated in sloppy mud, maybe even in an autumn setting, we'll see in the next video. However, it was because of the original reference picture. You can see how the rolled wheels are packed with mud, and that's such a cool detail. That alone was a strong indication that the real tank was also covered in mud, and again, it's just fun when you have a workflow you're comfortable with. I found that in thicker layers, the acrylic mud tends to have a relatively smooth finish, but this is easily improved once it starts drying, and you just have to poke the crust with something sharp, such as an old airbrush needle. The only problematic part was the plastic tracks. These are always very fragile, and a rock-hard acrylic mud can absolutely obliterate them, so my application had to be very subtle. Metal tracks would have definitely been more suitable for this type of finish. Once the mud was dry, I could mix a desaturated dust tone from Tamiya acrylics. Buff was the highlight color for the tank's base coat, so that alone wouldn't really provide any contrast between the paint job and the mud tones, so I added a drop of German grey, which not only made it less saturated, but also darker. We can already see how good the contrast looks, and that's just the pre-shading. Very basic and just preparation for the actual weathering. The tracks were also completely sprayed with this mixture. Luckily, lacquer thinners won't do any harm to those plastic pins. I'd say we're already looking pretty good, but I forgot about one important thing, and without it I couldn't pre-dust the upper surfaces. We're talking about real earth from my garden, trademark, and dried sea balls from AK Interactive, probably also trademark. This is also a trick I haven't used for a while, and it's a shame because not only it greatly improves the texture of the model, but also working with enamels is easier because of it. VMS Ballast Freeze is a bulletproof way of fixing it all in place, and you can use tap water to further blend or move the debris around to your liking. You gotta be careful though and soak up any excess fixer, otherwise it'll leave ugly blobs on the surface when it dries. Now I could finish the pre-dusting on the upper surfaces of the tank, completing the initial texture stage and getting it ready for enamel effects. Gotta say that it looks pretty good already, but it's gonna be unrecognizable once I'm done here. Here are the 3 main enamel colors I'll be using on this model, and later in the diorama. I made the test section on one side to get more comfortable with everything, and the rest of the model can be now finished on autopilot because I already know exactly what look I'm after. The first layer might seem kinda redundant because I'm just painting rainmarks effects over everything, and because it's very similar to the pre-dusting color, it might feel like a waste of time. One might actually think that there's no point applying dried earth effects on a tank covered with sloppy mud, but it's actually crucial for the final result. Applying all 3 types of mud over each other will give us dramatic and authentic looking weathering. What I like about enamels is how they can be easily modified with the right tools. VMS pigment texture is a colorless powder that can be mixed with any type of paint, and depending on how much you add, you can turn a thin enamel wash into a gritty paste. Ideal for those heavy specks of mud and clumps of soil stuck to the armor. VMS has some cool stuff in their portfolio, and if you'd like some of them, you can use my promo code UNCLENS if you're buying directly through their website, or another code MOFRIENDS2023 if you're buying from mishtoy.com, links in the description. Also, heavy weathering shouldn't be applied equally over the entire model, especially if we want those precious effects we created earlier visible. As such, I decreased the amount of dirt as I worked my way toward the top of the tank. The acrylic pre-dusting was a good roadmap for that, so I knew exactly where should I focus my efforts. The next layer was dark mud, or a mid-tone in this palette, simulating darker, damp mud. I didn't cover as much surface with this one as the previous layer, quite the opposite actually. I focused it mainly on those parts where heavier mud buildup was concentrated. This means over the textured acrylic mud, around details where moisture would accumulate for longer periods, and fun fact, this also works in conjunction with the post shading because it effectively adds contrast to those details. And because we're not just about smooth gradients but also gritty textures, I added it in the form of speckling as well. Texture, contrast, what's there not to like? The cool thing is that these enamels can be layered on top of each other in one session. They become quite durable once they dry, no less thanks to the matte grippy surface of the model. And here's where the benefit of adding loose debris pays off. It's a good anchor point for those darker tones and helps you achieve contrast on horizontal surfaces more easily. And finally, there's the wet mud, the darkest and also the only glossy tone in this lineup. However, it depends on how thick you apply it and how much you blend it. More subtle equals it'll probably dry to a flat finish. This way you can create smooth gradients not just in the color but also in its texture, from light and dry mud tones to dark and glossy ones. Again, note that I'm covering an even smaller area than before. One reason is what I already mentioned, the other is that even a small amount of paint goes a long way once you start blending it. Fun fact, even during construction when I ripped this fender off, I wasn't looking forward to the weathering in this area, but suddenly it became my favorite part of the model. Too bad the main focal angle in the diorama is gonna be the opposite side, where the story takes place, but hey, it's gonna be a cool Easter egg. But applying these tones aggressively is one thing. However, check out how they can be used to add subtle contrast to relatively clean areas such as the roof of the turret. All the while, most of the previous effects are left untouched. Tracks had to be completely covered in mud, and that wasn't very easy. Enamel thinner can soften the plastic pins that hold them together, and as you can imagine, not many good things would come out of that. To fix this issue, I avoided blending with enamel thinner altogether and created all of the mud buildup with speckling, and then, in a more controlled manner, with stippling. I focused it mostly toward the center of each track and also on the edges to give them some definition. I used a flat brush very gently moistened with thinner to remove the mud from the polished areas, and I painted those with the same natural steel acrylic paint from AK as I did before on the wheels. Well, gotta say, that didn't turn into a disaster and the tracks totally transformed the model. It's always a good idea to invest some time into them because along with the running gear, they often make up for roughly 1/3 of the entire model. The rest was just about finishing touches, such as adding smoke residue on the muffler with black pigments, and that's the only instance where I still use pigments, then adding various stains of grease, moisture, spilled gasoline, you name it, I made sure to add it, with the aid of oil paints. And finally, polishing the worn edges with a graphite stick. This gives a heavily chipped tank a proper metal look, and with this model there are so many sharp edges, I'm afraid I'm gonna cut myself on one of them. And yeah, that sometimes happens when you're just about done. Well, my friends, that's another finished model and another full-blown video. I talked about this adjusted format in my channel update at the start of the year, and how long projects such as this one would be segmented into construction, full painting and weathering, and finally a diorama video. But putting that aside, let me know how you like the model. I wasn't quite sure about the finished result because I had no clear idea about it, but I knew that I'd have tons of fun because the shape of the tank and the amount of detail on the surface meant there was always something to do, no matter which technique I'd be using. The brown base color was an interesting change, and everything about the model felt very refreshing. Its compact size meant every step was reasonably quick and none of them felt like a chore, but what did really put a smile on my face was the heavy mud. I haven't done that in a while and I almost forgot how time consuming it can be, but when done properly, it's extremely rewarding and definitely catches the eye. Honestly, I can't wait to put it in a muddy diorama and paint the remaining 2 figures. Until then, I want to sincerely thank all of you for your support, and a special shout out has to go to my wonderful patrons who make this show possible. If you're helping me out there, or you're here just to watch videos and have a good time, you're helping me tremendously, and thanks to you, I can do this hobby as a full-time job. Thank you, and if you like what I'm doing and would like to see more, you can consider joining me on Patreon as well. I'm posting there almost every day with updates from my workbench. We can get in touch through DMs, comments and emails. I'm posting 1 week early ad-free videos and these stay there forever so you can always get back to them. I also have a folder full of 3D models which you can download and print for your own projects, a bunch of real-life references for old buildings, various types of terrains and so on, and last but not least, these higher resolution studio pictures which show this model in more detail than video ever could. It would help me a lot, but hey, no pressure. Okay, my friends, these smaller tanks are always a lot of fun because they look cute yet awesome at the same time. I'm the last one to blow my own trumpet, but I gotta say, this is probably going to be one of my favorite models so far. We'll see how the diorama goes, and until we find out, you all stay safe, stay awesome, build those models in your stash, don't just collect them, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!